At the wedding, she saw her billionaire CEO ex alone in a wheelchair. When her son called him daddy, her world stopped. Let's start the beautiful story together. Don't forget to like and comment. Sometimes fate doesn't knock. It kicks down the door and leaves you bleeding on the floor. Nigel Love stood frozen in the doorway of the Riverside Country Club ballroom, her borrowed black dress suddenly feeling like armor that wouldn't protect her from what she was seeing. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers, crystal exploding against marble in a sound that seemed to echo through her very soul. There, in the corner of the room, sat the man who had destroyed her life. Richard Paget, her first love, her greatest mistake, the father of her son, and he was in a wheelchair. "Mommy, you're shaking." Jason's small hand tugged at her dress, his bright eyes wide with concern. At 7, he was too young to understand why his mother looked like she'd seen a ghost, but old enough to sense that something was terribly wrong. "I'm fine, baby," she whispered, but the words came out cracked and breathless. She couldn't look away from Richard. He hadn't seen her yet. His head was down, staring at his hands folded in his lap. The confident, commanding man she'd once loved was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken. "Nigel, you made it!" Monica appeared in a whirlwind of white silk and joy, her face glowing with bridal happiness. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind. And Jason! Look how handsome you are." But Jason wasn't listening to the bride. His gaze had followed his mother's across the room, and something flickered in his young face. Recognition. Curiosity. Nigel felt her heart stop. "Who's that sad man, Mommy?" Jason asked, pointing directly at Richard. "Nobody," Nigel said quickly, grabbing his hand. "Just nobody, sweetheart." Monica followed their gaze, and her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's Richard Paget. You know, the CEO of Paget Industries. He's my cousin's business partner. Poor thing, he's been like that for years now. Some kind of accident, I think. He hardly ever comes to social events anymore. But Nigel, are you okay? You look like you're about to faint." Nigel couldn't answer, because at that moment Jason broke free from her grip and began walking across the ballroom floor. Not walking, running, straight toward Richard. "Jason, no!" But her voice was lost in the music and conversation of 200 wedding guests. She watched in horror as her son approached the man in the wheelchair. Richard looked up, probably expecting to shoo away an annoying child, but instead his face went completely white. Even from across the room, Nigel could see the exact moment recognition hit him. Those were his eyes looking back at him. His chin, his stubborn cowlick that never stayed flat. "Are you sad because you can't dance?" Jason asked, his voice carrying with the clarity that only children possess. The entire conversation at nearby tables went quiet. Nigel felt every eye in the room turning toward them, but she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor, as if the marble had turned to quicksand. Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair until his knuckles went white. He started, then stopped. His eyes found Nigel across the room, and the look that passed between them held 8 years of pain, anger, and questions that had no answers. "My daddy can't dance either," Jason continued, completely oblivious to the emotional bomb he was detonating. "Mommy says he's away on business, but I think maybe he's sad like you. Do you want to be friends? Sad people should stick together." A strangled sound escaped Richard's throat. Several guests were now openly staring, and Monica's hand was gripping Nigel's arm like a vice. "Nigel," Monica whispered urgently, "what is going on? Why is Jason talking to— oh my God, is that—" But Nigel was already moving, her paralysis broken by pure maternal instinct. She had to get to Jason before he said anything else, before this situation became any worse than it already was. She pushed through the crowd of wedding guests, muttering apologies as she bumped into elegant couples and knocked over champagne flutes. But she was too slow, too late. "My name is Jason," her son was saying as she approached. "What's your name?" Richard's eyes were filled with tears now, his chest rising and falling like he was drowning. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I'm Richard." "That's a nice name," Jason said with the easy acceptance of childhood. "You have the same eyes as me. Look!" He pointed to his own face, then to Richard's, completely delighted by the discovery. The blood drained from Richard's face entirely. His gaze snapped to Nigel, who had finally reached them, and the accusation in his eyes was like a physical blow. "Jason, come here, now!" Her voice was sharp with panic. But Jason wasn't finished. He leaned in close to Richard, as if sharing a secret, and said the words that would change everything. "I wish you were my daddy. You look like you give really good hugs." The sound Richard made was inhuman, part sob, part gasp, part roar of anguish. Several guests gasped audibly, and Nigel heard someone whisper, "Is that child his?" "Jason, we're leaving. Right now." Nigel grabbed her son's hand, but he pulled away. "But, Mommy, I like him. He's nice, even if he's sad. Can we stay and play?" "No, we cannot stay and play." Her voice was rising, drawing even more attention. "We have to go home." "But now, Jason!" The sharpness in her tone finally penetrated her son's excitement. His lower lip began to tremble, and tears filled his eyes, the same eyes that were staring at them from Richard's face. "I'm sorry," Jason whispered to Richard. "He didn't mean to make Mommy mad." Richard reached out instinctively, his hand stopping just short of touching Jason's face. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "Nothing at all." Nigel felt like she was drowning. The room was spinning. Voices were buzzing around them like angry bees, and she could feel her carefully constructed life crumbling like a house of cards. "Nigel." Richard's voice was stronger now, commanding in a way that brought back memories she'd buried deep. "Don't you dare walk away from me again." The words hit her like a slap. She turned to face him fully for the first time in 8 years, and the pain in his eyes nearly brought her to her knees. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Not here, not now." "Then where?" he demanded. "When?" "Because I'm pretty sure I deserve some answers." Jason looked between them, confusion and fear replacing his earlier joy. "Mommy, why are you crying? Did I do something bad?" "No, baby. You didn't do anything bad." She knelt down to his level, trying to shield him from the stares and whispers surrounding them. "But we have to go now. Will I see you again?" Jason asked Richard over his mother's shoulder. Richard's eyes never left Nigel's face as he answered, "Yes, you will definitely see me again." The promise in his voice was unmistakable, and Nigel felt her world tilt on its axis. She stood up, lifted Jason into her arms despite his protests, and began pushing through the crowd toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear Richard calling her name, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't, because if she looked back, she might see the man she'd once loved more than breathing, and she wasn't strong enough to survive losing him twice. But as she reached the ballroom doors, Jason's voice carried across the sudden silence. "Bye, Daddy." Nigel's steps faltered, and she heard Richard's wheelchair moving behind them, the mechanical whir of the motor cutting through the wedding music like a blade. She ran. Chapter 2: The Devastating Truth Unfolds. The knock came at dawn, sharp and relentless, like the judgment of God. Nigel jolted awake on her second-hand couch, her neck stiff from sleeping upright. She'd been afraid to go to bed, afraid to close her eyes, afraid that somehow Richard would materialize in her living room like a ghost from her past. The knocking continued, each rap against her apartment door like a nail being driven into a coffin. Jason was still asleep in his bedroom. Thank God. After their flight from the wedding, he'd cried himself to exhaustion, asking over and over why they had to leave the nice, sad man behind. She'd told him they had to go because the party was too loud, but 7-year-olds weren't easily fooled. He knew something was wrong. The knocking stopped, and for a moment Nigel allowed herself to hope that whoever it was had given up. Then she heard the voice that had once whispered promises in her ear, now cold and commanding. "I know you're in there, Nigel. We need to talk." Her blood turned to ice. Through the thin walls of her apartment, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television turning up louder, as if her elderly neighbor was trying to drown out the drama unfolding in the hallway. The building was old, the walls paper-thin, and privacy was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Go away," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing to talk about." "Like hell there isn't." The doorknob rattled, and she realized with horror that she'd forgotten to engage the deadbolt in her panic last night. "Either you open this door or I'll open it myself. You can't just—" The door swung open, and Richard Paget rolled into her life like a storm surge, powerful and destructive and completely unstoppable. His wheelchair was sleek, expensive, everything in her shabby apartment that wasn't, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath, dark, intense, and filled with a pain so raw it made her chest ache. "Hello, Nigel." She wrapped her bathrobe tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how she must look, hair tangled, face puffy from crying, standing in an apartment that probably cost less per month than he spent on coffee. The contrast between them was stark and humiliating. "You can't be here," she said, backing toward the kitchenette. "This is breaking and entering." The door was unlocked. His voice was steady, controlled, but she could see his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the wheels of his chair. "And I think we're past worrying about social niceties, don't you?" He moved further into the room, taking in every detail with those sharp eyes she remembered too well. The second-hand furniture, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the photograph of Jason on his first day of school taped to the refrigerator. His gaze lingered on that photo for a long moment, and she saw his jaw clench. "Is he mine?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Direct, cutting, impossible to deflect. Nigel's first instinct was to lie, to protect Jason from this man who could destroy their simple life with a snap of his fingers. But those eyes in the photograph were unmistakably Richard's, and denying it would only make her look foolish. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't insult my intelligence, and don't insult his. That child has my eyes, my chin, my goddamn cowlick. He called me daddy in front of 200 people. So I'll ask you again, is Jason my son?" Her legs gave out and she sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. 8 years of carefully constructed lies and half-truths crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. "Yes." The admission was barely a whisper, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. She heard Richard's sharp intake of breath, the sound of his hands gripping his wheelchair so tightly the leather creaked. "Jesus Christ." His voice was hoarse, broken. "How long were you going to keep this from me? Forever?" The accusation in his tone snapped her head up, and suddenly the fear was replaced by a rage that had been simmering for 8 years. "Keep it from you." She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I tried to tell you before he was born." "That's bullshit, and you know it." "Is it?" She strode to her bedroom and returned with a small wooden box, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside were hospital bracelets, ultrasound photos, and at the bottom, a letter addressed to Richard Paget that had never been sent. "I came to your office. I waited for hours. Your security guards told me you didn't want to see me." Richard's face went pale. "What security guards? What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, Richard. It doesn't suit you." She pulled out a business card, yellowed with age. "Your mother's personal security team. They said you'd left specific instructions that I was not to be allowed near you under any circumstances." "My mother?" The words came out strangled. Eleanor Paget herself came down to the lobby to make sure I understood the message. Nigel's voice grew stronger as the old fury returned. "She told me you'd moved on to someone more suitable, someone who wouldn't embarrass the family name. She said you'd laughed when you heard I was calling, asking if I really thought you'd tie yourself to some nobody for the rest of your life." The color drained from Richard's face entirely. His hands were shaking now, not from nervousness, but from what looked like barely contained rage. "She told you I said that?" "She didn't have to tell me. I heard you myself. The memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday." I was standing outside your office door when you took a phone call. You said you were glad to be rid of the distraction and that you could finally focus on building something that mattered. Richard's eyes closed, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. The Henderson merger. I was talking about the Henderson merger falling through. It had been consuming months of my life, and when it collapsed, I was relieved to focus on other projects. Convenient story. It's not a story, it's the truth. His eyes snapped open, blazing with intensity. I was never told you came to see me. If I had known, if I had any idea you were pregnant, you would have what? Dropped everything to play house with the help? The words hung between them like a slap. Richard flinched, as if she'd struck him physically. Is that really what you think of me? Something in his voice made her pause. There was no anger now, just a bone-deep weariness that made him look older than his years. She studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found only pain. I think you're a Paget, she said finally, and Pagets protect their own interests above everything else. My mother did this. It wasn't a question. Richard's voice was hollow, distant. She orchestrated the whole thing. Made sure you never got near me. Made sure I never knew about Jason. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, where does that leave us now? Nigel's voice cracked. You want to waltz back into our lives and play daddy. Jason doesn't even know you exist. To him, you're just the sad man from the wedding who was nice to him. But he called you daddy because he's never had one. The words exploded out of her, raw and painful. He's 7 years old, and he's never had a father figure in his life. He sees any older man who's kind to him and projects his fantasies onto them. It doesn't mean anything. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. Where is he now? Sleeping. And he's going to stay that way until you leave. I want to see him. Absolutely not. He's my son. He's my son. The words came out fierce, protective. I'm the one who was up all night when he had fever. I'm the one who held him when he cried, because the other kids at school have daddies, and he doesn't. I'm the one who works 3 jobs to keep a roof over his head and food on the table. Being a sperm donor doesn't make you a father, Richard. The words hit their mark. Richard's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the broken man she'd seen at the wedding, instead of the commanding CEO who'd stormed into her apartment. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear to God, Nigel, I didn't know. Well, now you do. She walked to the door and held it open. So what are you going to do about it? Richard looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. The pain was still there, but it was being overshadowed by something else. Something that made her stomach clench with fear, determination. I'm going to get to know my son, he said, rolling toward the door. And I'm going to make up for 8 years of lost time. Richard, don't... He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her, and the man she saw there was no longer broken. He was every inch the billionaire CEO who'd built an empire from nothing, who crushed his enemies and got what he wanted through sheer force of will. You kept him from me for 8 years. Nigel, whether it was your choice or my mother's manipulation, the result is the same. I missed his first word, his first step, his first day of school. I missed everything. You can't just, I can and I will. His voice was steel wrapped in silk. I have resources you can't imagine, and I will use every single one of them to claim what's mine. The threat was unmistakable, and Nigel felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Is that what Jason is to you? Property to be claimed? Richard's expression softened slightly, but the determination never wavered. He's my son, and I'll be damned if I let another day go by without him knowing that. He rolled out of her apartment and down the hallway, leaving Nigel standing in the doorway with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Behind her she heard the soft patter of bare feet on linoleum. Mummy? Who was that man? She turned to find Jason standing in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes and looking confused. Her heart broke all over again as she saw Richard's eyes looking back at her from her son's face. Nobody, baby. Just a man who was lost. But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. Richard Paget wasn't lost anymore. He'd found them, and God help them all, he wasn't going away. Chapter 3. War is declared. The law office smelled like leather and broken dreams. Nigel sat across from Margaret Chen, a family lawyer who'd agreed to take her case for what she could afford, which was practically nothing. The woman's kind eyes couldn't hide the grim reality. They were going to war with cannons, while the enemy had nuclear weapons. "I have to be honest with you, Nigel," Margaret said, sliding a thick file across the desk. "Richard Paget has retained Harrison, Blackwood and Associates. They're the most expensive family law firm in the state, and they don't lose." The file was already an inch thick, and it had only been a week since Richard's visit to her apartment. Nigel flipped through pages of legal documents, her head spinning at the formal language that seemed designed to make her feel small and powerless. "What does all this mean?" "It means he's filing for joint custody, claiming you willfully concealed his paternity and denied him his parental rights." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "They're also requesting a full investigation into your living situation, financial stability, and fitness as a parent." The words hit her like physical blows. "Fitness as a parent? I've been Jason's only parent for 8 years. "I know, and that's what we'll argue. But Nigel, you need to understand what you're up against. Richard Paget's lawyers are going to scrutinize every aspect of your life. They'll find every mistake, every struggle, every moment where you weren't perfect, and they'll use it against you." Through the window, Nigel could see the gleaming towers of downtown, Richard's empire stretching toward the sky like fingers reaching for heaven. Her own world felt so small in comparison, a cramped apartment, multiple jobs, a life held together with determination and prayer. "Can they really take him away from me?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and that silence told Nigel everything she needed to know. "We're going to fight this with everything we have," Margaret said finally. "But I need you to prepare for the possibility that the court might see Richard as the more stable parent. He has unlimited resources, a large home, the ability to provide for Jason's education and future in ways that I can't." The words tasted like ashes in Nigel's mouth. "That's not what I said." "But it's what you meant." Nigel closed the file, unable to look at any more legal documents that reduced her life to insufficient assets and questionable choices. "Money makes right, is that it?" "The law is supposed to consider what's in the best interest of the child," Margaret said carefully. "But the reality is that courts often equate financial stability with overall stability. It's not fair, but it's the system we're working within." Nigel's phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart sank as she read it. Third notice. Pay rent by Friday, or face eviction proceedings. She was fighting for her son, while barely keeping a roof over their heads. Meanwhile, Richard probably spent more on lunch than she made in a month. "There's something else," Margaret said, her expression growing even more grave. "His lawyers are requesting a psychological evaluation for both you and Jason." "What? Why?" "They're claiming that your decision to keep Jason from his father shows poor judgment and potential emotional instability. They want to ensure that Jason hasn't been psychologically damaged by the absence of his father." The irony was crushing. Jason was about to be psychologically damaged, all right, by being torn between two parents who were hell-bent on destroying each other. The first custody hearing was held in a sterile courtroom that felt more like a morgue than a place where families were supposed to be healed. Nigel wore her best dress, a navy blue number she'd found at a thrift store, and altered herself, and tried not to feel intimidated by the army of lawyers surrounding Richard. He looked different in his tailored suit, every inch the powerful CEO despite the wheelchair. When their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw no trace of the broken man from the wedding, or even the desperate father from her apartment. This was Richard Paget in his element, and she was just another obstacle to overcome. "Your Honor," Richard's lead attorney began, his voice smooth and confident, My client is a loving father who was denied the opportunity to know his son through no fault of his own. Ms. Love made a unilateral decision to exclude him from Jason's life, depriving both father and child of their fundamental rights. Nigel watched the judge's face, trying to read his expression as the lawyer painted her as a vindictive woman who'd weaponized her child against his father. Every word was carefully chosen, technically true, but missing the crucial context that would explain her actions. Furthermore, Your Honor, Ms. Love's current living situation raises serious concerns about stability. She works multiple jobs, leaving Jason in the care of various babysitters and neighbors. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with documented safety issues. Meanwhile, my client can provide Jason with a stable home, excellent educational opportunities, and the financial security every child deserves. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, Nigel could hear the uphill battle in her voice. Your Honor, Ms. Love has been Jason's primary caregiver since birth. She has provided him with love, stability, and moral guidance, despite facing significant financial challenges. My client attempted to inform Mr. Paget of his paternity years ago, but was turned away. She believed, reasonably, that he had rejected both her and their unborn child. But even as Margaret spoke, Nigel could see they were losing. The judge's attention seemed to drift when Margaret talked about love and stability, but he'd taken careful notes when Richard's lawyer mentioned financial security and educational opportunities. The court will order a temporary custody arrangement while a full investigation is conducted, the judge announced. Mr. Paget will have supervised visitation with Jason every Saturday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., beginning this weekend. The gavel fell like a death sentence. Nigel felt the courtroom spinning around her as the reality sank in. She was losing her son, piece by piece, to a man who had the power to take everything from her. Saturday morning came too soon. Nigel stood in her living room, watching Jason play with his worn toy cars on the coffee table, and tried to figure out how to explain that his whole world was about to change. Sweetheart, do you remember the man from the wedding? The one in the wheelchair? Jason looked up, his face brightening. The sad man. Is he coming to play? The innocence in his voice made her chest ache. His name is Richard, and he's going to spend some time with you today. Really? Why? How did you explain to a 7-year-old that his entire life was about to be dissected in court? That the father he'd never known was fighting for the right to be part of his world? Because he cares about you, Jason. And sometimes when grown-ups care about children, they want to spend time together. Jason considered this with the seriousness that children brought to important matters. Will you be there too? Not today, baby. But I'll pick you up later, okay? The knock on the door was soft this time, almost apologetic. When Nigel opened it, she found Richard waiting with a woman in a business suit, the court-appointed supervisor who would monitor his visits. Hello? Jason, Richard said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it since the wedding. Would you like to go to the park? Jason nodded eagerly, already reaching for his jacket. But as they prepared to leave, he turned back to his mother with worried eyes. You'll be here when I get back. I promise, Nigel said, kneeling down to hug him tight. I'll be right here. She watched from the window as Richard's driver helped Jason into the back seat of a luxury car that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years. Her son's face was pressed against the glass, waving at her until they disappeared around the corner. The apartment felt empty without him, echoing with silence that seemed to mock her. This was just the beginning. If Richard got joint custody, she'd be spending half her life in this empty space, missing her son's laughter, his questions, his presence that made everything else bearable. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Nigel, it's David. David Martinez, the high school teacher she'd been dating for the past year. Kind, stable, everything Richard wasn't and everything she apparently didn't deserve. I heard about the custody case, he said, his voice careful. I wanted to call and see how you're holding up. I'm fine. she lied, sinking onto the couch where Jason had been playing just minutes before. No, you're not. And that's okay. What you're going through, it's hell. I can't imagine. The kindness in his voice almost broke her. David had been patient with her walls, understanding about her past, accepting of the parts of her story she'd been willing to share. But this was bigger than anything they'd faced together. David, I need to tell you something. Richard Paget, he's Jason's father. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, she wondered if he'd hung up. The billionaire, he said finally. The guy who's been all over the news lately. Yes. Jesus, Nigel, why didn't you tell me? And 'cause I never thought he'd come back. I never thought I'd have to deal with any of this again. Another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was different, distant, careful. I've been doing some thinking about us, about where this relationship is going. Her stomach dropped. She could hear the breakup coming in his tone, the careful distance of someone preparing to retreat. I care about you, Nigel, I really do. But this is bigger than I can handle. You're about to be in a legal war with one of the most powerful men in the state. The media attention alone is going to be insane. And Jason, he's going to need all of your attention, all of your energy. David, please. I can't compete with that. I can't compete with him. And I don't want to be the guy who walked away when things got tough. But I also can't pretend I'm equipped for this kind of battle. The line went dead, leaving Nigel alone with the silence and the devastating realization that Richard hadn't just declared war on her. He'd already started winning. Her relationship was over, her home was threatened, and her son was spending the day with a man who had the power to take him away forever. She looked at the stack of legal bills on her kitchen counter, the eviction notice tucked beneath them, and wondered how much more she could lose before there was nothing left to fight for. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of rain began to fall against her window like tears from heaven. The war had begun, and she was already losing. Chapter 4. The Poisonous Victory. Victory tasted like poison when it destroyed the thing you were fighting for. Richard sat in his study. The custody agreement spread across his mahogany desk like a battle plan that had succeeded too well. Joint custody, 50-50 time, legal recognition as Jason's father. Everything he'd demanded, everything his lawyers had fought for, everything that should have felt like vindication. Instead, he felt like he was drowning. Mr. Paget? His housekeeper, Maria, appeared in the doorway with the careful expression she wore when delivering bad news. Jason is asking for his mother again. He's been crying for an hour. Through the ceiling, Richard could hear the muffled sobs of his 8-year-old son, their son, coming from the guest bedroom that had been hastily converted into a child's room. Expensive toys filled every corner, educational games were stacked on custom shelves, and a bed that cost more than most people's cars sat in the center of it all. Everything a child could want, except the one thing Jason actually needed. His mother. "I'll be right up," Richard said, but Maria didn't move. "Sir, perhaps it would be better if we called Miss Love. He keeps asking when she's coming to get him, and I don't think he understands." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. This is his home now, too. He needs to adjust. But even as he said it, Richard knew he was lying to himself. Jason wasn't adjusting. If anything, he was getting worse with each visit. The bright, curious child who'd approached him at the wedding was disappearing, replaced by a scared, confused little boy who cried himself to sleep every night he stayed here. Richard wheeled himself upstairs, each turn of his chair feeling like he was climbing toward his own judgment. The hallway was lined with family photos, generations of Pagets who'd built empires and broken their enemies. None of them had ever faced an 8-year-old who looked at them like they were the enemy. "Jason," he knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Can I come in?" The crying stopped, but there was no answer. Richard pushed the door open to find Jason curled up in the corner of the massive bed. clutching a small stuffed elephant that he'd brought from his mother's apartment. It was worn and faded, clearly well loved, and it looked pathetically small in the expensive room. "Hey, buddy." "What's wrong?" Jason looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that were so much like Richard's own. It hurt to see them filled with such misery. "I want to go home." "This is your home too now," Richard said, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Remember? The judge said you get to stay here every other week, but I don't like it here." The words were whispered, as if Jason was afraid of hurting Richard's feelings, even in his distress. "It's too big and too quiet, and it doesn't smell like Mommy." Richard felt his heart crack a little more. He'd hired decorators, bought the best of everything, tried to create a perfect space for his son. But he'd forgotten that home wasn't about things. It was about the people who made you feel safe. "What if we call your mom? Would that help?" Jason's face lit up for the first time in days. "Really? Can I talk to her?" Richard dialed Nigel's number, dreading the conversation, but unable to deny his son this small comfort. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Is everything okay? Is Jason hurt?" The immediate panic in her voice reminded Richard that this war wasn't just between them anymore. Every decision, every battle, every victory hurt the child they were both supposed to protect. "He's fine. He wants to talk to you." Richard handed the phone to Jason and watched his son's entire demeanor change. The tears stopped, his face relaxed, and for a few precious minutes he was just a little boy talking to his mother about his day. "I miss you too, Mommy," Jason whispered into the phone. "When can I come home?" "I don't like the big house. It makes me feel scared." Richard couldn't hear Nigel's response, but he could see Jason's face fall. "But I don't want to stay here anymore. Please, Mommy, please come get me." The conversation continued for another few minutes before Jason reluctantly handed the phone back. His tears had returned, and he looked at Richard with an expression that made Richard want to disappear. "She says I have to stay. She says the judge said so. Jason, I know this is hard. Why can't you just come visit me at my real home?" Jason's voice was small but pointed. "Why do I have to live in two different places? None of my friends have to do that." It was a fair question, and Richard didn't have a good answer. "Because I wanted to prove I could. Because I was angry and hurt and wanted to win. Because I thought having you here would somehow heal the 8 years I lost." None of those reasons mattered to an 8-year-old who just wanted his life to make sense again. "Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be," Richard said finally. "Are you and Mommy going to get married?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Because Tommy at school says when his parents got divorced, they fought a lot. But then they got married to other people, and now he has 2 houses too. But his new stepdad is nice and plays baseball with him." "Do you know how to play baseball?" Richard looked down at his wheelchair, at the legs that would never run bases or throw pitches in the backyard. Another thing he couldn't give his son, another way he was failing before he'd even begun. "Nobody. I can't play baseball." Jason's face fell, and Richard felt like he'd disappointed his son yet again. Everything he touched seemed to turn to ash. Every attempt to connect only highlighted what was missing. "But maybe we could find other things to do together," Richard said quickly. "Things that we both enjoy." "Like what?" Richard looked around the expensive bedroom, at all the toys and games and educational materials that Jason hadn't touched, and realized he had no idea what his son actually enjoyed. He'd bought what he thought an 8-year-old should want, not what Jason specifically needed. "What do you like to do? What makes you happy?" Jason considered this seriously. "I like to help Mommy cook, and I like to read stories. And sometimes we go to the park and feed the ducks, but we can't do that very much because Mommy has to work." Simple things, ordinary things, things that had nothing to do with money or expensive toys or proving a point. "We could feed ducks," Richard said. "There's a pond not far from here." "Really?" For the first time since arriving, Jason looked genuinely interested. "Do you think the ducks here are different from the ones at home?" "Only one way to find out." They spent the afternoon by the pond, Jason's face brightening as he threw bread to the ducks and chattered about which ones were his favorites. For a few hours, Richard forgot about custody agreements and legal battles and just watched his son be a child. But even in those peaceful moments, Jason would mention his mother, how she'd taught him that baby ducks were called ducklings, how she always brought extra bread because she felt sorry for the skinny ducks, how she'd promised they'd come back next week if he was good. Every mention was like a knife in Richard's chest, a reminder that he was an intruder in his son's life, not a natural part of it. That evening, as Richard tucked Jason into bed, his son looked up at him with those heartbreakingly familiar eyes. "Daddy, Richard." It was the first time Jason had called him any version of Daddy since the wedding, and Richard's throat constricted. "Yes, I'm glad you're my dad, but I wish you and Mommy weren't mad at each other." "We're not mad at each other, buddy." "Yes, you are." Jason's voice was matter-of-fact in the way only children could be. "You use your scary voices when you talk about each other, and Mommy cries after I talk to you on the phone." The observation hit Richard like a physical blow. In his determination to claim his rights as a father, he'd forgotten that Jason was watching every interaction, absorbing every harsh word, internalizing the conflict between his parents as somehow being his fault. "Jason, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. The grown-up stuff between your mom and me, it has nothing to do with you. But if I wasn't born, you wouldn't be fighting." The logic was simple and devastating and completely wrong, but Richard could see how an 8-year-old mind would make that connection. He was destroying his son in his attempt to save him. "If you weren't born," Richard said, choosing his words carefully, "my life wouldn't have any sunshine in it. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, even if I didn't know it for a long time." Jason smiled at this, but Richard could see the sadness still lurking in his eyes. "Will you and Mommy ever be friends again?" It was an innocent question with no good answer. How could he explain that sometimes love turned into something darker? That pride and hurt could poison even the deepest connections? That he and Nigel were trapped in a cycle of retaliation that was destroying everything they'd once meant to each other? "I hope so, buddy. I really hope so." But as Jason finally drifted off to sleep, Richard sat in the expensive bedroom, surrounded by untouched toys, and felt the weight of his hollow victory. He'd won the legal battle, but he was losing his son. Jason was becoming a casualty of a war between adults who'd forgotten what they were supposed to be fighting for. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Court date set for full custody hearing. We're confident we can get primary custody, given the financial disparity and your stable home environment." Richard stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Looking at his son's tear-stained face in the dim light, he realized that winning this war might cost him everything that actually mattered. But it was too late to stop now. The machine was in motion, the lawyers were paid, and somewhere across town, Nigel was probably lying awake in her empty apartment, missing her son and hating the man who'd taken him away. They were all drowning in the poison of his victory, and Richard didn't know how to make it stop. Chapter 5. The Nuclear Option. Evil wore pearls and spoke with the refined accent of old money. Eleanor. Paget stood in Nigel's cramped living room like a general surveying a conquered territory. Her designer handbag, worth more than Nigel's monthly salary, clutched in manicured fingers. She hadn't knocked, somehow she'd simply appeared. As if powerful people could bypass ordinary courtesies like locked doors and privacy. "Ms. Love." The name dripped from Eleanor's lips like something distasteful. "I believe it's time we had a conversation." Nigel instinctively moved to block the hallway that led to Jason's bedroom, even though her son was still at school. Every maternal instinct screamed danger as she faced the woman who destroyed her life 8 years ago and was clearly here to finish the job. "How did you get in here?" Eleanor smiled, the expression cold enough to freeze blood. Doors open for people who know how to turn the right keys. May I sit? No. Say whatever you came to say and leave. Very well. Eleanor remained standing, her posture perfect despite her 70-something years. I'm here to offer you a solution to your current predicament. My predicament. This unfortunate custody battle that's tearing my grandson apart and bringing unwanted attention to my family. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Richard may be too blinded by newfound paternal feelings to see the damage being done, but I am not. Nigel felt her chest tighten. If you're here to threaten me, threaten. Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. My dear girl, I don't make threats. I simply present facts and allow intelligent people to draw their own conclusions. She opened her handbag and withdrew a manila folder, setting it on Nigel's coffee table with the care one might use for a loaded weapon. Fact number 1. You filed for government assistance 3 years ago and failed to report income from a weekend cleaning job. That's welfare fraud, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Nigel's blood turned to ice. The cleaning job had been under the table, just $20 a week to help with groceries. She'd forgotten to report it, an honest mistake in the chaos of working multiple jobs and raising Jason alone. Fact number 2. You've left Jason in the care of Mrs. Rodriguez next door on numerous occasions, without proper childcare licensing verification. That constitutes child endangerment under state law. She's a grandmother who loves children. I checked her background myself. But you didn't file the proper paperwork with social services, did you? Eleanor's smile grew sharper. And fact number 3, your tax returns for the past 2 years contain several discrepancies, small things really. The kind of mistakes that could be honest errors or evidence of systematic tax evasion. Each word fell like a hammer blow. Nigel sank onto the couch, her legs no longer able to support her as the true scope of Eleanor's power became clear. You've been investigating me. I've been protecting my family, something you would understand if you had one worth protecting. Jason is my family. Jason is a Paget. Eleanor's voice turned to steel. And Pagets don't grow up in poverty, raised by women who make careless mistakes and poor decisions. Nigel's hands clenched into fists. You can't prove any of this was intentional, can I? Eleanor pulled out another document. Here's a sworn statement from your former employer at the diner, stating that you asked to be paid in cash to avoid taxes. Here's another from Mrs. Rodriguez, expressing concern about how often you left Jason in her care while working. And here's a letter from your current landlord, documenting multiple late rent payments and complaints about noise violations. Each piece of paper felt like a nail in Nigel's coffin. She recognized the letterhead, the signatures, the terrible truth that Eleanor had turned her entire life into evidence against her. Mrs. Rodriguez would never... Mrs. Rodriguez has a son who's been struggling with immigration status. Amazing how helpful people become when their own families are threatened. The casual cruelty of it took Nigel's breath away. Eleanor hadn't just investigated her, she'd turned her friends and neighbors into weapons against her. What do you want? I want what's best for everyone involved. Eleanor sat down now, her movements graceful and predatory. I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 in exchange for your signature on a few documents. She pulled out a contract, the legal language dense and intimidating. But Nigel could read enough to understand the gist. She would sign away all parental rights to Jason and agree never to contact him or Richard again. You want me to sell my son? I want to save him from a life of mediocrity and you from a prison sentence. Eleanor's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than tearing apart a family. The choice is yours, of course. Sign these papers, take the money, and disappear. Start a new life somewhere far away, where you can't hurt my family anymore. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning I'll have these documents delivered to the district attorney's office. By afternoon, you'll be arrested on multiple felony charges. Jason will be placed in temporary state custody while you await trial, and Richard will be granted emergency custody as his biological father. The room was spinning. Nigel gripped the arm of the couch, trying to anchor herself as her world collapsed around her. Even if you're acquitted, which is unlikely given the evidence, the trial will take months, years possibly. And during that time, Jason will be living with Richard, bonding with him, forgetting you. When you finally get out of prison, you'll be a stranger to your own son. Eleanor's words painted a picture so vivid and horrible that Nigel could see it unfolding like a nightmare. Jason crying for her in a foster home, then slowly forgetting her face as months passed. Richard raising him with expensive toys and private schools, telling him his mother was a criminal who'd abandoned him. "He'll hate me," Nigel whispered. Children are remarkably adaptable. Richard was very young when his father died, and he adjusted beautifully to having only me as a parent. Jason will do the same. Richard knows about this, doesn't he? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been irritation. Richard is too sentimental to do what's necessary. He's convinced that somehow this war will end with everyone happy and whole. But you and I both know better, don't we? This can only end one way, with Jason choosing between parents who've destroyed each other in their battle for him. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes boring into Nigel's soul. Is that really what you want for him? To grow up feeling responsible for the hatred between his parents? To be a prize in a war that neither side can truly win? The words hit their target with surgical precision. Nigel had seen the toll the custody battle was taking on Jason. The tears, the confusion, the way he blamed himself for his parents' anger. Every night he was away, she lay awake knowing he was crying for her in Richard's mansion. Every day he came home, he seemed a little more damaged by the conflict. "You have 48 hours to decide," Eleanor said, standing with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her own power. "After that, the district attorney receives an anonymous tip about your various indiscretions." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I do believe you love Jason, but love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step aside and let their child have the life they deserve. The life you think he deserves. The life that money and position can provide. Safety, education, opportunities, a future without limits." Eleanor's smile was almost pitying. "You can give him love, my dear. But can you give him Harvard? Can you give him connections that will open doors throughout his life? Can you give him the confidence that comes from never having to worry about money?" The questions were knives, each one cutting deeper because they touched on Nigel's deepest fears. She'd lain awake countless nights worrying about Jason's future, about whether her love would be enough to overcome the limitations of their circumstances. "Think about it," Eleanor said softly. $500,000 is enough to start over somewhere else. College, perhaps, a career, a life where you're not defined by the mistakes of your past. Blood money. Survival money. Face the facts, Ms. Love. You're drowning, and I'm offering you a life preserver. The only question is whether you're too proud to take it. Eleanor left as silently as she'd arrived, leaving only the manila folder and the contract on the coffee table, like evidence of a visitation from the devil herself. Nigel stared at the documents until the words blurred together, her mind reeling with impossible choices. $500,000. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Enough to disappear, to start over, to build a life where she wasn't constantly one paycheck away from disaster. All she had to do was give up her son. Her phone rang, startling her from her spiraling thoughts. Jason's school number appeared on the screen, and for a terrifying moment she wondered if Eleanor's reach extended even there. "Ms. Love, this is Principal Martinez. I'm calling because Jason had an incident at school today." "What kind of incident? Is he hurt?" "He's not hurt, but he got into a fight with another student." According to witnesses, the other child said something about Jason's parents being in the newspaper, and Jason, well, he didn't handle it well. Nigel closed her eyes, the weight of her choices pressing down like a physical force. The custody battle was becoming public knowledge, turning Jason into a target for schoolyard cruelty. Another way their war was destroying the child they were fighting over. I'll be right there. As she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, Nigel's gaze fell on the contract Eleanor had left behind. 48 hours to choose between keeping her son and destroying him, or saving him by letting him go. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from a grey sky. Somewhere across town, Richard was probably in his mansion, unaware that his mother had just set in motion the final battle of their war. And in a few hours, Nigel would have to look into Jason's eyes and decide whether love meant holding on or letting go. The timer was ticking, and there was no good choice left to make. Chapter 6. The Desperate Flight. Desperation makes liars of even the most honest hearts. Nigel stood in her kitchen at midnight, staring at the signed contract and bearer bonds spread across her table like evidence of a deal with the devil. Tomorrow morning, she would take Jason and disappear forever. But tonight, she had to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old that his entire world was about to end. "We're going on a special trip," she'd told him at dinner, forcing brightness into her voice. "Just you and me. An adventure." Jason had been excited at first, asking if they'd see mountains or beaches, but his enthusiasm had faded when she'd deflected his questions about when they'd come back. Children had a way of sensing when adults were lying, and Jason was too smart for his own good. She'd packed their bags while he was asleep, moving like a ghost through their small apartment and trying not to think about everything they were leaving behind. Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who'd watched Jason countless times. The playground where he'd learned to ride a bike. The life they'd built together, modest but theirs. All of it disappearing because Eleanor Paget had turned love into a weapon. "Mommy." Nigel spun around to find Jason standing in his doorway, clutching his stuffed elephant and looking smaller than his 8 years. "What are you doing up, sweetheart?" "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about the trip." He walked into the kitchen, his bare feet silent on the linoleum. "Are we really coming back?" The question she'd been dreading. Nigel knelt down to his level, trying to find words that weren't lies, but weren't the whole devastating truth either. "I don't know, baby. Maybe not for a long time." Jason's face crumpled. "But what about Daddy Richard? I was supposed to see him this weekend. He's taking me to the zoo." Each word was a knife in her chest. Richard had been planning special outings, trying so hard to build a relationship with the son he'd never known existed, and she was about to rip that away from both of them. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices," she said carefully. "Sometimes we have to leave places we love to keep safe." Safe from what? How could she explain that they were running from lawyers and judges and the woman who'd already destroyed their family once? That Eleanor had manufactured criminal charges and she was too scared to fight anymore. From people who want to hurt our family. Jason's eyes widened. "But Daddy Richard is strong. He could protect us." The faith in his voice broke something inside her. Jason still believed his father was a hero who could fix anything, still thought the angry, bitter custody battle was just a misunderstanding that love could solve. "It's complicated, sweetheart. More complicated than you can understand. Is it because you and Daddy Richard are mad at each other?" The simple observation from her 8-year-old cut deeper than any of Eleanor's threats. From Jason's perspective, this was all just his parents being stubborn and mean to each other while he suffered for their inability to get along. "We're not mad, exactly. We just can't figure out how to be a family together. So you're giving up." The accusation in those 3 words made her flinch. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth she'd been trying to avoid. She was giving up. She was choosing the easy path over the right one, Eleanor's money over the fight for her son. I'm trying to do what's best for you. But I don't want to leave. Jason's voice rose, desperation creeping in. I like my school, and Mrs. Rodriguez, and my room, and Daddy Richard. Why can't we just stay and be happy? Because happiness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Because Eleanor Paget had made sure that staying meant prison and losing Jason anyway. Because love wasn't enough when the deck was stacked against you. Sometimes life isn't fair, baby. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do. That's stupid. Jason's lower lip trembled. You and Daddy Richard are both being stupid. Nigel reached out to comfort him, but he stepped back. His small face set in lines that reminded her heartbreakingly of Richard's stubborn expression. I don't want to go on a stupid trip. I want to stay here and see Daddy Richard tomorrow like we planned. Jason, no! The word came out as a wail. I hate this. I hate that you and Daddy Richard can't just be nice to each other. I hate that everything is always sad and scary and nobody tells me the truth. He ran back to his room, slamming the door behind him. Nigel heard the muffled sound of crying and felt like the worst mother in the world. She was destroying her son to save him, and he was too young to understand the impossible choice she'd been forced to make. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by suitcases and contracts, and the weight of decisions that felt too big for one person to bear. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe Eleanor was forcing her into a corner because she knew Nigel would choose flight over fight. Maybe there was another way if she was brave enough to find it. But bravery was a luxury she couldn't afford when her son's future hung in the balance. The crying from Jason's room eventually stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. Nigel checked on him around 2 in the morning and found him apparently asleep, curled up with his elephant and facing the wall. She tucked his blanket around him and whispered an apology he couldn't hear. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry for all of this. She set her alarm for 6, planning to wake him early and get on the road before Richard realized they weren't coming for their scheduled visit. By the time he figured out what had happened, they'd be hours away and untraceable. But when her alarm went off, Jason's bed was empty. Panic hit her like a physical blow as she searched the apartment, calling his name and finding nothing but silence. His backpack was gone, along with the drawing he'd made of their family and the toy car Richard had given him last weekend. A note on his pillow, written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Gone to find Daddy Richard. Don't worry. Love, Jason. Nigel's hands shook as she called Richard's number, her heart hammering against her ribs. He answered on the first ring, his voice thick with sleep. Nigel, what's wrong? Is Jason with you? What? No, he's with you. Why would he? He's gone. The words came out in a rush. He left a note saying he was going to find you. Richard, he's out there alone in the city. I'm on my way. The line went dead, leaving Nigel alone with her terror and the devastating realization that her attempt to protect Jason had put him in more danger than any custody battle ever could. She called the police, but they told her that since it hadn't been 24 hours, they couldn't officially treat it as a missing persons case. They'd put out a bulletin for patrol officers to watch for him, but an 8-year-old boy in a city of millions was a needle in a haystack. Richard arrived at her apartment 20 minutes later, his face haggard and his eyes wild with the same fear that was eating her alive. How long has he been gone? I don't know. I checked on him around 2 and he was asleep. When I woke up at 6, he was gone. So he could have been out there for 4 hours. Richard's voice was hollow. Anything could have happened. They stared at each other across her living room, all their anger and legal battles suddenly meaningless in the face of their shared terror. This was their son, their child, lost somewhere in a city that could swallow him whole. Where would he go? Nigel asked. He doesn't know your address. He's never been to your house without a driver. The office. He knows I work downtown, and it's the only landmark he'd recognize. Richard was already pulling out his phone. I'll call my security team, have them check every street between here and there. I'll take the bus route. He might have tried to follow the path we usually take to court. It was the first time they'd worked together instead of against each other since this whole nightmare began. Fear had stripped away their pride and left only parents desperate to find their child. "Nigel," Richard's voice stopped her at the door. "Whatever my mother said to you, whatever she threatened, we'll figure it out, together, after we find Jason." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could overcome Eleanor's carefully constructed trap. But hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed too many times. "Just help me find our son," she said instead. As they left her apartment to search for Jason, Nigel caught sight of the contract still sitting on her kitchen table. Eleanor's solution to their problem, bought and paid for, waiting for a signature that might never come, because some things mattered more than money or safety or even freedom. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds. And their son, lost somewhere in the grey morning light, was worth everything they had. Chapter 7. The Empty Years. Time was supposed to heal all wounds, but some wounds just festered in the dark. 3 years had passed since that terrible night when Jason ran away. 3 years since Richard and Nigel had searched the city together until dawn, and found their son sleeping in a bus station downtown, cold and scared and begging them not to fight anymore. 3 years since Nigel had taken Eleanor's money and disappeared with Jason into a life that felt more like exile than freedom. Richard sat in his study, the same room where he'd once planned hostile takeovers and billion-dollar mergers, now reduced to staring at old photographs and drinking expensive whiskey that did nothing to numb the pain. The business empire he'd built was crumbling around him, board members circling like vultures, as his depression and reclusiveness made him a liability to his own company. "Mr. Paget?" Maria appeared in the doorway, her face creased with the worry that had become her permanent expression. "You missed another physical therapy appointment. Dr. Morrison called to reschedule." Richard didn't look up from the photo in his hands, Jason on his 7th birthday, grinning as he blew out candles on a cake that had probably cost more than most families spent on groceries. It was the last picture they'd taken together before Nigel vanished with him. "Cancel all my appointments." "Sir, you've been cancelling for months. Your recovery." "My recovery is meaningless when there's nothing to recover for." Maria's silence spoke volumes. She'd watched him deteriorate from a powerful, driven man into someone who barely left his bedroom, let alone his house. The wheelchair that had once been a tool for mobility had become a prison of his own making. "There's been another letter," she said quietly. Richard's head snapped up. For 3 years, he'd hired private investigators to track down Nigel and Jason, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars from his personal trust funds on leads that went nowhere. While his company struggled under his neglectful leadership, his family's generational wealth remained untouched, a bitter irony that allowed him to fund his desperate search while everything else crumbled. Where? Oregon. A teacher thinks she saw a boy matching Jason's description in her class, but using a different name. Oregon. They'd tracked similar leads to Colorado, Nevada, even Canada. All dead ends, false hopes that left Richard more broken than before. "Don't bother. She's too smart to stay anywhere we might find them." But even as he said the words, Richard felt the familiar stirring of desperate hope. Somewhere out there, his son was growing up without him. Jason would be 10 now, probably taller, maybe playing sports or learning to read music or developing interests that Richard would never know about. "Should I call the investigator?" "No." The word came out flat and final. "I'm done chasing ghosts." 2,000 miles away in a small town outside Portland, Nigel stood at the kitchen sink of their modest rental house and watched Jason, now calling himself Jake Morrison, kick a soccer ball around their tiny backyard. He'd grown several inches in the past year, his face losing its childish roundness and beginning to show hints of the young man he'd become. Richard's eyes stared back at her from Jason's face, a daily reminder of everything they'd lost. "Mom, can I walk to the store?" 10-year-old Jason called through the screen door. "Mom, not Mommy anymore." That had ended around his 10th birthday, another small death in a life full of them. "Take your phone and be back before dark." She watched him grab his jacket and head down the street, moving with the casual confidence of a child who'd learned to adapt to new places and new names with each move they'd made. They'd lived in 7 different towns since leaving home, never staying anywhere long enough for Jason to form real friendships or for anyone to ask too many questions about their past. Her phone buzzed with a text from her manager at the diner where she worked nights. "Can you pick up Sandra's shift?" She called in sick. Another double shift. Another 16-hour day that would leave her exhausted and irritable. The money Eleanor had given them was carefully managed, but not infinite, and Nigel had learned to stretch every dollar to keep them afloat. She texted back her agreement and tried not to think about how much she'd aged in the past 3 years, how the stress and isolation had carved lines around her eyes and grey streaks through her hair. Jason came home an hour later with groceries and a carefully neutral expression that had become his default since they'd started running. "How was school today?" "Fine." The same answer he'd given every day for the past year. Fine. Never good, never bad, just fine. As if he'd learned that showing too much emotion, positive or negative, might somehow expose them to danger. "Did you finish your math homework?" "Yeah. Want to watch a movie tonight?" "I picked up that superhero one you mentioned." Jason shrugged. "Sure, I guess." The enthusiasm he'd once shown for everything from bedtime stories to trips to the park had been slowly leaching out of him, replaced by a resignation that no 11-year-old should possess. Nigel knew she was losing him by degrees, watching him retreat into himself as the isolation and constant moving took their toll. "Jason, Jake, we need to talk." He looked up from unpacking groceries, and for a moment his mask slipped enough for her to see the sadness he kept hidden. "Are we moving again?" The question hit her like a physical blow. They'd moved twice in the past year alone, chasing job opportunities and running from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about their past. "No, baby. We're staying put for a while." "Good." The word came out with more force than he'd shown in months. "I'm tired of being the new kid. I'm tired of making up stories about why we don't have any family photos or why I can't remember where I was born." Nigel felt her chest tighten. She taught him to lie so well that deception had become second nature, but at what cost? Her son was disappearing behind a wall of manufactured stories and careful distance from anyone who might care about him. "I know this is hard." "Do you?" Jason's voice was sharper than she'd heard it in years. "Do you know what it's like to not have any friends because we might leave tomorrow? Do you know what it's like to pretend your whole life is different than it really is?" The accusations hung in the air between them, each one cutting deeper because they were true. In trying to protect him from Eleanor's machinations, she'd stolen his childhood and replaced it with a series of lies and temporary lives. "I was trying to keep you safe." "From what? You never really told me what we were running from. Just vague stuff about people who wanted to hurt us. But nobody's been chasing us, Mom. Nobody even knows we exist." The bitterness in his voice was devastating. Her 11-year-old son sounded like someone who'd already given up on happiness, who'd accepted that life was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Everything's always complicated with grown-ups." Jason's eyes, so much like Richard's, blazed with frustration. "Can't you just tell me the truth for once? Can't you trust me enough to explain why we left everything behind?" The truth. That his grandmother had manufactured criminal charges to force them into exile. That his parents had been so busy destroying each other that they'd almost destroyed him in the process. That every day they stayed hidden was another day she was stealing from his relationship with his father. The truth is, that sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt the people they love. And sometimes those mistakes are so big that running away seems like the only solution. What kind of mistakes? Nigel looked at her son, this boy who'd grown up too fast, who'd learned to hide his true self behind careful lies and protective distance, and made a decision that terrified her. Your father and I fought about you, about who you should live with and who could take better care of you. We fought so hard and so mean that we forgot what was best for you. Jason's expression softened slightly. Is that why we left? Because you were scared I'd choose him over you? The perceptiveness of the question stole her breath. Even at 11, Jason could see straight to the heart of her fears and insecurities. I was scared of a lot of things. Scared of losing you, scared of not being good enough, scared of being hurt again. But what if I wanted to see him? What if I missed him? The whispered question broke her heart completely. All these years, she'd assumed Jason had forgotten his father, moved on from those few precious weeks when Richard had been trying to build a relationship with him. But children didn't forget that easily, especially not relationships that had shown such promise. Do you miss him? Jason nodded, tears filling his eyes for the first time in months. Every day, I remember how he looked at me like I was the most important thing in the world, and how he was sad but tried to hide it so I wouldn't worry, and how he said my name like it meant something special. Each memory was a knife in Nigel's chest, a reminder of what she'd taken from both of them. Richard had been learning to be a father, and Jason had been learning to have one, and she'd destroyed that fragile beginning because she'd been too scared to fight for it. Mom! Jason's voice was small, younger than his years. Do you think he still thinks about me? The honest answer would destroy what was left of her son's childhood. The lie would be kinder, but would add another brick to the wall she'd built around their lives. I think he thinks about you every single day, she said quietly. I think he misses you more than you'll ever know. Then why can't we go home? A home. Jason still thought of their old life as home, despite everything that had happened. Despite 3 years of running and hiding and building new lives in new places, because some bridges get burned so badly that you can't cross them again. But what if we tried? What if we went back and said we were sorry and tried to fix things? The hope in his voice was devastating in its innocence. He still believed that love could overcome anything, that apologies could heal wounds that had festered for years. It's not that simple, baby. Why not? Because Eleanor Paget was still out there, still pulling strings and manipulating outcomes. Because the criminal charges she'd manufactured were probably still waiting, suspended like a sword over Nigel's head. Because 3 years of absence had probably convinced Richard that she was exactly the vindictive woman his mother had painted her to be. Because sometimes you can't go back. Sometimes you can only go forward. Jason stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A decision being made, a line being drawn. What if I don't want to go forward anymore? What if I want to try going back? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Nigel realized that her 11-year-old son was stronger and braver than she'd ever been. He was willing to fight for what he wanted, instead of running from what he feared. Jason, my real name is Jason Paget, he said quietly, and I want to go home. The words hit her like a physical blow, but underneath the pain was something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe some bridges could be rebuilt if you were brave enough to try. Maybe love really could overcome the mistakes of the past, if you let it. Chapter 8. The Crash and Consequences. Some days you break, and some days you shatter completely. The rain hammered against the windows of Richard's penthouse like bullets from heaven, each drop echoing the emptiness that had consumed his life for the past 4 years. It was Jason's 11th birthday, a day Richard had been dreading for weeks, knowing he'd spend it alone while somewhere across the country his son celebrated without him. 11 years old. Jason would be starting middle school soon, his voice probably changing, his interests shifting from toys to more complex pursuits. All the milestones Richard would never witness, all the conversations they'd never have, all the love he'd never be able to give. The whiskey bottle beside his wheelchair was nearly empty, but the pain remained stubbornly present. Alcohol had stopped working months ago, just like the sleeping pills and the therapy sessions and the desperate attempts to convince himself that life was worth living without. The people who mattered most. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Board meeting moved to Thursday. Dr. Morrison rescheduled your appointment again. Maria asked me to remind you to eat something. The concern of his employees felt like pity. Their careful politeness a reminder that he'd become a shadow of the man who'd once commanded boardrooms and built empires. The company was hemorrhaging money under his distracted leadership, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the board voted him out. He didn't care. The only thing that had mattered in his life was somewhere in Oregon or Colorado, or wherever Nigel had taken their son, growing up without him and probably forgetting his face. Richard wheeled himself to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he'd once conquered. 40 stories below, traffic moved like blood through arteries, people living their lives and pursuing their dreams, while he sat trapped in a prison of his own making. Happy birthday, Jason, he thought, pressing his palm against the cold glass. I hope you're happy wherever you are. I hope you don't hate me for letting you go. But even as he thought it, Richard knew it was a lie. He hadn't let Jason go. Jason had been stolen from him by fear and pride, and the poison his mother had injected into their lives. And he'd been too broken to fight for him, too convinced of his own unworthiness to demand what was rightfully his. The wheelchair's motor whirred as he backed away from the window and headed for his bedroom. In the nightstand drawer, beneath insurance papers and legal documents, was the bottle of pills his doctor had prescribed for sleep. Enough for one very long sleep, enough to make the pain stop forever. He'd been thinking about it for months, planning it like a business merger. Clean, efficient, no mess for Maria to clean up. Just a man who'd lost everything that mattered, choosing to join the darkness that had already consumed his soul. Richard transferred from his wheelchair to the bed, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd long ago stopped caring about physical discomfort. The pill bottle felt heavier than it should in his hands, each small tablet a promise of peace. Jason won't even know, he told himself. He'll grow up thinking his father just disappeared. Maybe that's better than knowing the truth. He was reaching for the water glass when his phone rang. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Nothing anyone had to say could matter now, but habit made him check the caller ID, and his heart stopped. Oregon area code, a number he didn't recognize, but from the state where his private investigators had last tracked Nigel and Jason. With trembling fingers, he answered. Hello? Heavy breathing, the sound of someone crying, and then a voice he'd dreamed about for 4 years. Daddy Richard? Is this really you? The pill bottle fell from his nerveless fingers, scattering tablets across the expensive carpet like fallen stars. Jason, I found your company online and called the number. The lady said she'd put me through to you. The words came out in a rush, desperate and young, and heartbreakingly familiar. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to me. Richard's chest felt like it was caving in. His son's voice was different, deeper, older, but still unmistakably the child who'd called him Daddy at a wedding 4 years ago. Of course I want to talk to you. God, Jason, I've missed you so much. I missed you too. The admission was whispered, as if Jason was afraid someone might overhear. I think about you every day. I remember how you looked at me like I was special. You are special. You're the most important thing in my life. Really? Even though I've been gone so long? The pain in that question made Richard want to find whoever had convinced his son that he might be forgotten or unwanted and tear them apart with his bare hands. Especially because you've been gone so long. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you, wondered where you were, hoped you were happy and safe. I'm not happy. The words came out small and broken. Mom tries, but we move around a lot, and I can't make friends and I have to pretend to be someone else all the time. I don't even feel like me anymore. Richard closed his eyes, fury and heartbreak warring in his chest. Nigel had stolen their son's childhood, turned him into a fugitive from his own life. But underneath the anger was a deeper understanding. She'd been scared, backed into a corner by his mother's threats, making desperate choices to protect the child she loved. Where are you now, son? A town called Forest Grove. It's outside Portland. Mom works at a diner, and I go to school here, but we might move again soon. She's been looking at apartments in other states. Still running. Still afraid. Still keeping Jason from the life he deserved. Jason, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you somewhere safe? Somewhere you can talk freely? Yeah, Mom's at work. I'm home alone. A pause. I'm sorry I called. I know I'm probably not supposed to, but it's my birthday and I wanted to hear your voice. Richard's heart shattered completely. His son was spending his 11th birthday alone, missing the father who'd been too broken to fight for him. Don't ever apologize for calling me. You can call me any time, day or night, for any reason or no reason at all. But what if Mom finds out? She gets scared when I ask about you. She says it's complicated. Complicated. The word adults used when they'd made such a mess of things that the truth was too painful to admit. Your mother loves you very much, Richard said carefully. She's been trying to protect you, even if her methods weren't perfect. Protect me from what? She never really explains. Just says there are people who want to hurt our family. But I don't understand who or why. How could he explain Eleanor's manipulation? The manufactured charges, the web of lies and threats that had driven Nigel to run. How could he tell a 12-year-old that his own grandmother had been willing to destroy his family to maintain her vision of Paget perfection? Sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt the people they love, Richard said. And sometimes those mistakes get so tangled up that it feels impossible to fix them. But you could try, couldn't you? You and Mom could talk and figure it out. The hope in Jason's voice was devastating. Even after 4 years of separation, he still believed his parents could overcome their differences if they just tried hard enough. It's not that simple, son. Why not? Don't you love each other anymore? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Did he still love Nigel after everything she'd put him through? After 4 years of being denied access to his son, after the legal battles and the running and the endless gnawing pain of missing them both? Yes, God help him, yes. Love isn't always enough, he said quietly. Sometimes there are too many walls between people, too much hurt and fear and pride. But what if we could tear down the walls? What if we all said we were sorry and tried to start over? The innocent faith in his son's voice made Richard want to believe in impossible things. But some bridges were burned too thoroughly to rebuild, some damage too extensive to repair. Jason, there are things you don't understand. Then explain them to me. I'm 12 now, not a little kid. I can handle the truth. Richard looked around his empty penthouse, at the pills scattered on the floor like abandoned dreams, at the life he'd built that felt meaningless without the family he'd lost. Maybe Jason was right. Maybe the truth, however painful, was better than the lies and half-explanations that had kept them all trapped for so long. Your grandmother, my mother, she didn't approve of your mom. She thought Nigel wasn't good enough for the family, so she made sure we couldn't be together. How? She made it look like your mother had done things that could get her in trouble with the police. She gave her a choice, take money and disappear forever, or go to jail and lose you anyway. Silence stretched across the phone line as Jason processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice was harder, older, so she chose to run. She chose to protect you the only way she knew how. And you let her go. The accusation was quiet, but devastating. Richard had no defense, no explanation that would justify his failure to fight for them. I was broken, Jason. After my accident, after losing you both, I couldn't see a way to fix things. I convinced myself you were better off without me." "That's stupid!" The blunt assessment from his 12-year-old son was perhaps the most honest evaluation Richard had heard in years. "We weren't better off. We were all miserable and alone. I know that now. So what are we going to do about it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. What were they going to do? Richard looked at the pills on the floor, the physical evidence of how close he'd come to giving up permanently, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find a way to bring our family back together." "Really? You promise?" "I promise. It might take time and it might be complicated, but I won't give up again. Not on you, not on your mother, not on us." "I love you, Daddy Richard." The words hit him like a revelation, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. After 4 years of absence, his son still loved him, still wanted him, still believed they could be a family. "I love you too, Jason, more than you'll ever know." They talked for another hour, Jason sharing stories about school and friends and the places they'd lived. Richard drinking in every word like a man dying of thirst. When they finally hung up, Richard felt more alive than he had in years. He looked at the scattered pills, at the evidence of how close he'd come to making the ultimate mistake, and began picking them up one by one. Somewhere in Oregon, his son was waiting for him to figure out how to bring their family home. And for the first time in 4 years, Richard believed it might actually be possible. But first, he had to face the woman who'd nearly destroyed them all, and convince her to help him undo the damage she'd done. His mother was about to learn that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Chapter 9, The Collision Course. The truth was a weapon that cut both ways, but some lies were too dangerous to leave standing. Richard sat across from his mother in her pristine office, the same room where she'd orchestrated the destruction of his family 4 years ago. Edna Paget looked older now, her steel-grey hair perfectly coiffed, but unable to hide the lines that worry and guilt had etched around her eyes. She knew why he was here. The confrontation had been building since Jason's phone call 3 weeks ago. "You look better," she said, pouring tea with the steady hands of someone who'd perfected the art of appearing calm, while her world collapsed around her, more focused. "I was beginning to worry about your mental state." "Were you?" Richard's voice was steady, controlled, but underneath lay 4 years of accumulated rage. "Or were you just worried that I might actually do something about what you did to my family?" Eleanor's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. I don't know what you mean. Jason called me. On his birthday. From Oregon." Each word was delivered with surgical precision. "He told me about the constant moving, the fake names, the way his mother jumps at shadows because she's still afraid of the criminal charges you manufactured. I protected this family. You destroyed this family." The words exploded out of him with such force that Eleanor actually flinched. "You took my son away from me. You turned the woman I loved into a fugitive. You made a 12-year-old boy believe his own father didn't want him." Eleanor set down her teacup and straightened her shoulders, the imperious matriarch reasserting control. "That woman was never good enough for you. She would have dragged you down, made you weak. Look what happened. She ran at the first sign of trouble instead of fighting for what she claimed to love. She ran because you backed her into a corner with lies and manufactured evidence. Evidence that could have been real if she'd continued making poor choices." Eleanor's voice turned cold, calculating. "Welfare fraud, child endangerment, tax evasion. These weren't complete fabrications, Richard. They were possibilities, potential futures that I simply accelerated." The casual admission of manipulation made Richard's vision blur with rage. His own mother, speaking about destroying innocent lives as if it were a business strategy. "You threatened to have her thrown in prison. I offered her a choice, money and freedom, or consequences for her careless behavior. She chose money, which tells you everything you need to know about her character. She chose to protect our son from being caught in the middle of a war between people who should have loved him more than their own pride. Eleanor stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the city her family had helped build. And where has that protection led? To a child living under false names, moving constantly, denied the advantages and opportunities his birthright should provide? She's turned your son into a nomad when he should be preparing for Harvard. He's miserable. Richard's voice cracked. He's 12 years old and he sounds like someone who's given up on happiness. That's what your protection accomplished. Temporary sacrifice for long-term gain. Once she's permanently out of the picture, she's never going to be out of the picture. Richard wheeled himself closer to his mother, close enough to see the shock in her eyes. She's Jason's mother. She loves him, and he loves her, and I'm going to find a way to bring them both home. You can't be serious. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. After everything she's done, the lies, the running, the way she's poisoned that boy against his own family, the only poison in Jason's life came from you. Richard pulled out his phone and played a recording he'd made of Jason's call, his son's voice filling the office. Mom gets scared when I ask about you. She says it's complicated. I don't even feel like me anymore. Eleanor's face went pale as she listened to her grandson's pain, the direct result of her manipulations. But when the recording ended, she lifted her chin with characteristic defiance. One phone call doesn't change the fundamental reality. She kept your son from you for 4 years. She chose money over fighting for her family. And now you want to reward that behavior by bringing her back into our lives. I want to fix what you broke. Richard's voice was steady now, purpose replacing rage. And you're going to help me do it. I most certainly am not. Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'll expose everything you did. The manufactured evidence, the threats, the way you turn my love for my son into a weapon against the woman who bore him. Richard leaned forward. How do you think that will play in the press? How will your social circle react when they learn that Eleanor Paget destroyed her own family to maintain her vision of genetic purity? Eleanor's mask slipped completely, revealing the frightened old woman beneath the imperial facade. You wouldn't. Try me. The silence stretched between them, mother and son locked in a battle that would determine the fate of 3 generations. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice smaller than Richard had ever heard it. What do you want me to do? I want you to call the district attorney and withdraw all the potential charges against Nigel. I want you to publicly admit that the evidence was fabricated, and I want you to help me convince her that it's safe to come home. And if she refuses, if she's built a life there and doesn't want to return. Richard had been asking himself the same question for weeks. 4 years was a long time. Nigel might have moved on, might have found someone else, might have decided that the pain of their past was too great to overcome. Then I'll respect her choice. But I'm going to give her the option to choose freely, without the shadow of your threats hanging over her head. Eleanor walked back to her desk, each step looking like it aged her another year. You realize this could destroy everything we've built. The family reputation, the business relationships, the social standing. I don't care about any of that without my son. And if this reunion fails, if you bring them back and it only leads to more heartbreak and conflict, then at least we'll fail honestly instead of living with the poison of your lies. Eleanor sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 70-plus years. I did it for you, you know. I saw how she destroyed your confidence, made you doubt yourself. I thought without her influence, you'd become the man you were meant to be. The man I was meant to be is Jason's father. Everything else is just details. For a long moment, Eleanor stared at her hands, and Richard saw something he'd never witnessed before. His mother, experiencing genuine regret. I'll make the calls, she said quietly. But Richard, if this goes badly, if bringing them back only leads to more pain, then that's my choice to make. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, Nigel stood in the principal's office of Jason's school, trying not to let her panic show as Mrs. Patterson explained her son's latest incident. "This is the third fight this month," the principal said gently. "And according to the other children, Jason started each one. When we try to talk to him about it, he just shuts down completely." Nigel looked through the office window at Jason sitting in the hallway, his face set in the sullen mask he'd perfected over the past year. At 11, he was getting bigger, stronger, and his anger was becoming something she couldn't control, with hugs and gentle words. "Has he said what's causing this behavior? He keeps insisting that his name isn't Jake Morrison, that we have his records wrong. He says his real name is Jason Paget, and he wants to go home." Mrs. Chen's voice was carefully neutral. "I've tried explaining that we need legal documentation for any name changes, but he becomes very agitated when we discuss it." The words hit Nigel like a physical blow. Jason was done pretending, done living the lie she'd forced him into. He was claiming his real name regardless of the consequences, and she was powerless to stop him. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask, is Jake in some kind of witness protection program? Are you running from an abusive situation? Because if you need help—" "No," Nigel said quickly. "Nothing like that. It's just complicated family circumstances." The same excuse she'd been using for 4 years, wearing thinner each time she said it. "I'm going to recommend counseling," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Jason is clearly dealing with identity issues and displacement anxiety. If we can't address the root cause of his anger, I'm afraid we'll have to consider suspension or even expulsion." Expulsion. Another school, another move, another layer of disruption in Jason's already fractured life. How many times could she uproot him before the damage became permanent? "Can I talk to him?" Mrs. Patterson nodded and left them alone. Jason looked up as his mother entered the hallway, and she was shocked by the defiance in his eyes. "Before you say anything," he said, "I'm not sorry. Tommy Henderson said my mom was probably a criminal since we don't have any family photos and move around so much. So I hit him. Jason. That's my name, Jason, not Jake, not whatever fake name you want to give me next week. Jason Paget." He stood up, and Nigel realized with shock that he was almost as tall as she was now. "And I'm done pretending to be someone else." "Sweetheart, you don't understand the consequences. I understand that you've been lying to me my whole life. I understand that you took me away from my father because you were scared. I understand that we've been running from problems you won't even explain to me." Other parents in the hallway were staring now, and Nigel felt the familiar panic of exposure, of being noticed and questioned. "Lower your voice." "No." Jason's voice was steady, determined. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being afraid. I want to go home and see my father and stop living like we're criminals. It's not that simple." "It is that simple." His voice broke with frustration. "You call him. You tell him where we are. You stop being scared and start being brave." The accusation hit its target. Nigel had been a coward, choosing flight over fight, allowing fear to dictate their lives for 4 years. But facing that truth now, with her son's future hanging in the balance, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. What if he doesn't want us back? What if too much time has passed? Then at least we'll know. Jason's voice softened slightly. "Mom, I love you, but I can't keep being nobody. I can't keep pretending I don't have a father who might miss me as much as I miss him." Nigel looked at her son, this boy who'd grown brave, while she'd grown frightened, and realized that her time as the sole decision-maker in his life was ending. He was old enough now to have opinions, to make demands, to refuse to accept the limitations fear had placed on their world. "If we go back, everything changes. There will be lawyers and courts and your grandmother who wanted us gone in the first place. Then we'll fight them, together. You, and me, and Dad." The simple faith in his voice reminded her of the woman she'd been before Eleanor's threats had broken her spirit. Once she'd been willing to fight for what she believed in. Maybe it was time to remember how. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we'll go home." Jason's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen in months. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it. But Jason, if this goes badly, if your grandmother tries to hurt us again, then we'll deal with it. But at least we'll deal with it as a family." As they walked out of the school together, Nigel felt like she was stepping off a cliff into empty air. But for the first time in 4 years, she wasn't falling alone. Somewhere across the country, Richard was fighting his own battles against the woman who'd torn them apart. And soon, God willing, they'd all have to face the wreckage of their past and decide whether love was strong enough to build something new from the ashes. The collision course had been set. Now all that remained was to see who would survive the impact. Chapter 10. The Hardest Victory. Some journeys end where they began, but the travelers are never the same. Richard sat in his rental car outside Washington Elementary School in Forest Grove, Oregon, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. 4 years of searching, 4 years of missing his son, and now they were separated by nothing more than a parking lot and his own terror that this reunion might destroy them all over again. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Doug confirmed all potential charges withdrawn. Public statement released this morning. The path is clear." Clear. As if 4 years of exile and heartbreak could be erased with a few legal documents and a press release. But it was a start, the first honest step toward undoing the damage his family had inflicted on itself. Through the school's front windows, he could see children moving through hallways, their laughter and energy a stark contrast to his own nervous stillness. Somewhere in that building was Jason, 12 years old now, probably taller, definitely changed by years of living as someone else. The front doors opened, and Richard's heart stopped. Nigel emerged first, her face set in the determined expression he remembered from their worst arguments. She looked older, wearier, but still beautiful in the way that had once made him believe in forever. Behind her walked a boy who was unmistakably his son, despite the years and growth that had transformed a child into an almost teenager. Jason, his boy, right there, close enough to touch if Richard could find the courage to get out of the car. As if sensing his presence, Jason looked across the parking lot and froze. Even from 50 yards away, Richard could see the exact moment recognition hit. The widening eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the way Jason's entire body went rigid with shock. "Dad," the word carried across the space between them, barely audible, but loud enough to shatter Richard's heart and rebuild it simultaneously. Nigel spun around, following her son's gaze, and her face went pale when she saw the car. For a moment, all three of them were statues in a tableau of impossible reunion. Father, mother, and son separated by years of mistakes and the terrible fragility of hope. Then Jason broke free from his paralysis and ran. Richard fumbled with his car door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the handle. By the time he managed to get out, Jason was halfway across the parking lot, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he sprinted toward the father he hadn't seen in 4 years. "Daddy! Dad, you came. You actually came." The impact of Jason's embrace nearly knocked Richard from his wheelchair, but he held on tight, breathing in the scent of his son's hair and feeling the solid warmth of a body that had grown so much during their separation. "I'm here," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here now. I knew you'd find us. I knew you wouldn't give up forever." Jason pulled back to look at his father's face, and Richard saw tears streaming down his son's cheeks. "You look different, sadder, but you're really here." "I'm really here!" Behind them, Nigel approached slowly, cautiously, like someone walking through a minefield. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions, joy at seeing Jason so happy, terror at what this reunion might cost them, and something else that Richard couldn't quite identify. "Hello, Richard." Her voice was exactly as he remembered, soft, melodic, capable of healing or breaking him with a single word. He looked up at her, this woman who'd borne his child and fled from his love, and felt 4 years of anger dissolve into something more complex. "Hello, Nigel, you look—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like accusations or pleas. "You look tired." "Running will do that to you." Her smile was rueful, self-deprecating. "Though I hear we're done running now." "My mother withdrew the charges, all of them, and she issued a public statement admitting they were fabricated to coerce your departure." Richard's voice was steady, but Jason could hear the years of pain underneath. "You're free to come home if you want to. If I want to." Nigel repeated the words as if testing their weight. "That's quite an if." "Mom, please." Jason looked between his parents, and Richard saw the fear creeping back into his son's eyes. "Please don't fight. Please don't make this complicated." The plea from their child cut through whatever walls Nigel had built around her heart. She knelt down to Jason's level, taking his hands in hers. "Baby, this isn't about fighting. This is about making sure we do this right this time. Your dad and I, we hurt each other badly before. We need to talk, to figure out how to be a family without destroying each other. But you will try." Jason's voice was small, vulnerable. "You'll try to fix things?" Richard and Nigel looked at each other over their son's head, and for a moment the years fell away. They were young again, in love again before pride and fear and Eleanor's manipulation had poisoned everything they'd touched. "We'll try," Richard said quietly. "But Jason, it might take time. It might be hard. We might make mistakes." "I don't care about mistakes," Jason said fiercely. "I just want us to be together. I want to stop pretending to be someone else. I want to go home." Home. Such a simple word for such a complex concept. Was home a place, or was it the people who loved you? Richard had spent 4 years learning the difference, and now he had the chance to rebuild both. "There are things we need to discuss," Nigel said, standing up and addressing Richard directly. "Legal things, practical things, where we'd live, how custody would work. What happens if we can't make it work?" Richard finished her sentence. "I know. I've thought about all of it. But Nigel, I'd rather fail trying to build something real than succeed at living a lie." She studied his face, searching for the man she'd once loved beneath the scars that 4 years of separation had carved. "You've changed." "We all have. The question is whether we've changed enough to do better this time." Jason looked between his parents, and Richard saw something shift in his son's expression, a maturity beyond his 11 years, born from too much adult conflict and too many broken promises. "Can I say something?" Jason asked. "Something important." Both parents nodded, and Jason took a deep breath before speaking with the gravity of someone much older. "I don't remember much about before, when you two were fighting in court and stuff, but I remember feeling like it was my fault. Like if I hadn't been born, you wouldn't hate each other." His voice wavered but held steady. "I don't want to feel that way again. If you're going to try to be a family, you have to promise me that no matter what happens between you, it's not about me. It's about you choosing to love each other or choosing not to." The wisdom in those words hit both adults like a physical blow. Their son had learned lessons at 7 that some people never learned in a lifetime, that love was a choice, that children weren't responsible for their parents' failures, that family required daily acts of courage and forgiveness. "You're right," Nigel said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you, whatever happens between your father and me, it will never be about you not being enough or being too much. You're perfect exactly as you are." "Agreed," Richard said firmly. "You didn't cause our problems, and you won't be responsible for fixing them. That's on us." Jason nodded, seeming satisfied with their promises. Then his face brightened with an expression that reminded Richard painfully of the child who'd approached him at a wedding 4 years ago. "So, can we go home now?" "All of us." Richard and Nigel exchanged glances, and in that look was the acknowledgement that they were about to step off a cliff together, with no guarantee of where they'd land. "It won't be easy," Nigel warned. "Your grandmother still doesn't approve of me. The press might get involved. People will have opinions about our family drama." "Let them," Richard said. "I'm done caring what anyone thinks except the 2 people in this parking lot. And if we can't make it work as a couple, if we're better as co-parents than as whatever we used to be, then we'll figure that out too. But we'll figure it out together, honestly, without lawyers or manipulation or threats." Richard's voice grew stronger. "We'll put Jason first always, but we'll also be honest about what we need to be happy. All of us." Nigel was quiet for a long moment, weighing decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. Finally, she looked at Jason's hopeful face and made her choice. "Okay, we'll go home. We'll try." Jason's whoop of joy echoed across the parking lot, drawing stares from other parents and children. He hugged first his mother, then his father, then somehow managed to hug them both at once, in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. "This is the best day ever," he declared. "Even better than Christmas." As they stood there in the fading Oregon sunlight, a family reunited but not yet repaired, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope tempered by realism, love strengthened by loss, and the understanding that the hardest victories were the ones most worth winning. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be therapy sessions and difficult conversations, legal paperwork, and awkward family dinners with Eleanor. There would be arguments and setbacks, moments when the old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But there would also be Jason's laughter echoing through Richard's empty mansion, Nigel's voice calling them to dinner, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust between 2 people who'd learned that love without honesty was just another form of destruction. It took 18 months of family counseling, court proceedings against Eleanor's illegal activities, and countless difficult conversations before Richard and Nigel were ready to try again as more than co-parents. Their small wedding ceremony was held in the same garden where they'd first kissed as teenagers, with Jason walking both parents down the aisle and serving as best man. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" the minister asked, "to love and cherish through whatever challenges life may bring?" Richard looked at Nigel, older now, wiser, scarred by their shared battles, but still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and felt the weight of their history and the promise of their future. "I do," he said, again and always, and for real this time. When they kissed, their son cheered loudly enough to startle the birds from the trees, and Richard knew that some journeys were worth every painful step it took to complete them. They'd found their way home at last,